I think that's something that, back to your point, that they really kind of that hurt them in a way, Josh, segue alert, that hurt Ohio State and Michigan, or Ohio State and Georgia. These are two teams who, especially in Ohio State's case, played one top 40 offense in terms of yards per play this year, and that's Michigan at number 18. One all year. And they were absolutely stunned by Georgia. In a similar way, Georgia was stunned by Ohio State. And just as we open this discussion talking about that game last night, I felt like Georgia had the potential to be shocked in a similar way that they were in 2017 against Oklahoma in the Rose Bowl. Talk about that a little bit, where these are two excellent teams that maybe didn't get to show their best foot with their defense just because of the lack of facing a good offense throughout the year.
Yeah, that's fair. And look, and these are good offenses in the playoffs, right? And I think sometimes we underestimate the step up that they represent. Something earlier when discussing Michigan, we talk about issues Michigan had, offensively issues they had. And we probably didn't spend enough time talking about the fact that TCU is just a good team. Quentin, as a receiver for TCU, was a level of play that they probably hadn't really seen. And, he ended up accounting for, I think, over 150 yards, the majority of the receiving yards in that game. And it's not a fluke. But it was pretty clear that Michigan, having dodged JSN and then getting up some yardage to Harrison, but being able to just keep him singularly in check, I don't know that they'd really had to deal with a team that had as many weapons active in a dynamic offense. Out that one game against Ohio State, and maybe you can say, and I think probably fairly say at this point, Ohio State didn't play well in that game. Here, both these teams had played, I think, one good offense. And Georgia had played Tennessee, largely shut them down. Tennessee's a weird eval. I mean, South Carolina shut them down too. They are Art Briles air raid to the core. And when you try to talk about shutting them down, one, if they're not hitting on their deep shots, that offense, dating back to the Baylor days, can just lay absolute eggs. Always has. And two, gimmicky is not the right word, but I'm trying to think of the better way to put it. I mean, just, I guess, schematically dependent on creating open receivers, that sometimes if you're playing certain things well, you can shut it down even if you're not necessarily a great pass defense. In the same way that you can be a good pass defense, and I think Alabama's pass defense is actually pretty good, and just get lit up to hell if you don't play well, which is what happened to them. And so I think Georgia kind of hid some warts defensively. We both probably overlooked the end of that LSU game. I know for my part, it was hard for me to take too much from that, having seen the Tennessee game, hadn't seen the rest of the season, and just assume that Georgia had issues in the secondary covering high-level receivers. I figured, hey, it's a game. They had a big lead in. They weren't really being too intense. Ended up playing a backup quarterback, weird scheme. Things got a little off the rails in a game they were leading. Okay, whatever. And LSU does have elite receiver talent. I mean, truly, they're elite receiver talent with Butte and Neighbors and all those guys. They're top shelf, or they were. They just never really played like it too much. But the talent, just like a lot of recent LSU teams with so many NFL guys, the talent's going to show up in the NFL, I think. And they played Ohio State, and for most of this game, they could not cover Ohio State to save their lives. There were things going on. Lassiter got targeted a lot. I think that's something Ohio State probably saw in the LSU game and said, hey, this is a guy we can target some. And it turns out he could not handle their high-level receivers. And the problem when you face a team like Ohio State is Ohio State, it's not just enough to say they've got Harrison, who's really good. It's the combination of Harrison and Fleming and Egbuka. Like it all stacks. And normally, if you got a guy that's really good at receiver, you can shade somebody over, you can bracket him and deal with him. And when you play a team that has three receivers like that, and you got a guy like Stover, and all of a sudden they're four wide, and every one of them is a high-level receiving threat, they're going to get a one-on-one. And Georgia probably can't really afford to bracket Harrison, because if you do that, you're probably not sound everywhere else. So you got to deal with him straight up. And now all of a sudden, Harrison is absolutely eating you alive. And I also saw we saw some things like Ringo, who's a very good corner. I think he's a very good athlete at corner. He maybe isn't a truly elite cover corner. He may be, I don't know. I think he's going to be an NFL player, but I could see him just as easily being somebody that's an NFL all-star in the slot in a certain role that maybe he's not really cut out to defend an NFL number one as a boundary corner. And I'm not saying that to be really critical. That's a very tough position to play. I'm just saying those are the things you don't see unless you play high-level offenses. You don't realize that, hey, this guy's been really good for us all year, but he doesn't have enough high-end speed. And I think the same thing happened with Ohio State. I mean, Georgia, from an efficiency standpoint, we talked about top 5 in the country in points per possession, really top 3. Efficiency monster, one of the best efficiency offenses the last couple of years in history. And Ohio State had to just constantly deal with this churn, and they handled the run game pretty well. And they tried to deal with the passing game, but they played tight and aggressive, and they kept giving up big plays down the field. They kept giving up sustained drives, and you could tell it kind of wore on them as the game went away. So for both these teams, I mean, you know, and the stats are gaudy, right? Kenny McIntosh had, I think, 5 carries for 70 yards. Georgia threw for 11.7 yards per attempt and 5.2 yards per carry, and ran for 5.2 yards per carry. Ohio State had theirs at 10.2 yards per attempt, only 3.7 yards per carry, but that's, again, their running back situation, I think, kind of crippled them. You could tell both of these teams, they just didn't really have an answer for the other one and what they wanted to bring, and it created the wild, crazy shootout that was at least really fun to watch.
A lot of people in the comments are saying that Ohio State was clearly the better team. Georgia got lucky, this and that. Look, you get lucky when someone fumbles a punt and you win 17-13. You don't get lucky when you have to score as many points as Georgia had to score last night. I think both of these were great teams, and it was an awesome game. I wouldn't want to in any way sort of demean this outcome by saying something like that. It just came down to a kick that was missed. I mean, they even got in a position to make that kick. We can talk about play calling there at the end, but I hate this notion that because a team scores more in the second and third quarter, but not the first and fourth quarter, even if they got a big lead, then they were the better team. No, it's all 4 quarters that matter. Like, that's what matters. So if the team comes from behind to win a game, they won the game. And I'm going to let you talk about that Brock Bowers stretch for the first down in a minute. But I think that really what was surprising to me in this game is it really felt like, maybe not surprising, but it really felt like if Ohio State got one more stop, got one more score, then it was completely over. And they never got it. But I also thought at the end that the play calling was a little weird, but it showed me that they didn't have a lot of confidence in that range for Ruggles, and they were trying to do everything they could to get about 7 to 10 more yards for him where he was comfortable, and he did have some nerves. But Josh, there's 2 things that people are talking about. I'm going to take one. I'm going to let you take the other. One is the non-targeting call in the end zone. I think they got it right, but I would not have been upset if they called it the other way. It was really close. I don't think it was targeting. I think that if you go frame by frame, you can see, but it didn't look like targeting to me, especially not in a way where Ohio State was actually screwed a couple of years ago against Clemson for targeting and a fumble and a replay. But the other that people are talking about is the Brock Bowers stretch for the first down, and I was pretty clear that it was the correct call, but there were some others that were up in arms. So why don't you break that down a little bit, and then we'll get into some super chats.
So the Brock Bowers play is actually correct, and it's correct black and white. It's not subjective. And if you want to see the image and what we're talking about, look at our Twitter at CFB Nerds. You can pull it up right now if you're sitting there, sitting there and got your phone handy. And you'll see the Brock Bowers image. We tweeted about it at CFB Nerds. When you are going out of bounds, there's a couple ways that those rules interpret where the ball is going to be spotted. And the biggest one that a lot of people are aware of is if you're diving out of bounds or you're stepping out of bounds, it's where the ball goes out of bounds. But the way that rule works is if you have a guy that's pushed out of bounds or diving out of bounds, it's where the ball goes out of bounds. The key is you are not currently in bounds when the ball crosses. The example I give for that is think of a guy that's tight roping down the sideline, right? So if I'm running down the sideline, the out of bounds is over here, and I'm tight roping, falling out of bounds, but I'm keeping my feet in, I still advance the ball, right? Everybody knows that. If I run past the first down marker and I haven't stepped out yet, I do advance the ball. Why is that? The ball is out of bounds. It crossed out of bounds. It's because as long as you are in bounds, if you are established in bounds, meaning you are touching in bounds and you have not touched out of bounds, you continue to advance the ball. While you're touching in bounds, the ball always advances. The cross, where the ball crosses out of bounds thing comes into play when you're in the air, not touching in bounds, but you haven't touched out of bounds yet. If you dive out of bounds, you get the benefit of the dive to the extent that the ball hadn't crossed the plane yet, right? So I'm not touching the field of play. I dive. I get the benefit of the dive until the ball goes out of bounds, and then I don't get the benefit of the dive once I'm out of bounds. Bowers on that play is in bounds and touching in bounds. That was the key. He starts to go down, puts his hand on the ground, and then his feet come up. So he's one hand in bounds in the field of play. His feet are in the air. They're not touching out of bounds. And then with his right arm, he brings the ball forward. Well, that means he's just like a player that's just running in bounds. He's in bounds, established in bounds. And as long as his hand is down in the field of play and his feet are not touching out of bounds, he can continue to advance the ball. Now, if his hand had come off the ground, he would not have been able to advance it further. And the moment his feet touched out of bounds, he could not advance it further. But he actually got the ball well past. There's a shot of the little line with the ball there and his hand down and his feet up at the first down marker, which shows he had the first down. But in truth, he actually kept going and got almost like a half yard past that before he finally ended up touching out of bounds. So it's a black and white call, honestly. And the confusion about that call entirely deals with the rules, which is that a ball that goes out of bounds is out where the ball crossed the boundary line when you're in the air. But if you're actually still touching in bounds, you can continue to advance the ball. Technical, hopefully I probably didn't explain it that well, but hopefully I explained it fairly well. But the upshot of it is it's actually black and white. He got the first down, and because he got the entire benefit of how far he moved the ball forward because he was touching in bounds and not touching out of bounds.
Mike Farino said, how's it going, y'all? Still super disappointed from last night, but man, this is probably the best playoffs we've had. Both games were amazing, and that Georgia-Ohio State game felt like it was an all-timer.